Hi everybody, what's the good word? Listen, I'm here to make a video that I've been wanting to make for a while, and it's a comparison between John Lennon and Paul McCartney's solo Beatle albums, and I'm going to tell you why I decided to go ahead and do this video. Well, it stems really, I guess you could say, from a lot of stuff I've been reading out there in cyberspace, social media, internet, online, whatever word you want to use, where John Lennon has become very marginalized these days. You know, there was a time right after John's tragic murder that he was held up as some kind of a saint, which was really out of proportion, and he never would have wanted that, and neither do we. I mean, he had his flaws and he had his bad points, and that's exactly what made him so human and endearing to a lot of us. But having said that, the tide has really turned, you know, in the past decades here, and it's gone completely from wrongly hailing John as a perfect human being to going to the other side and completely slandering him and bashing him and finding no redeeming qualities practically in the man. It's gone from one extreme to the other. Now that's possibly another video in itself, but what I call the marginalizing of John Lennon has extended even to his solo music career. You know, it's common right now for people, who like music, whether they're Beatles fans or just, regular music listeners, to just say, John Lennon had a pretty bad solo career. You know, his solo career was nothing really that great. And Paul McCartney had a better solo career, and this and that and the other thing. Well, this video aims to kind of balance the scales a little bit, and I'll show you how I come to this conclusion, okay? Now, to start with, if you were to ask me, who do I think, generally speaking, had the better solo career, I would say Paul McCartney. And the reason I would say Paul McCartney is because I'm considering the year, say, 1970, when the Beatles split up, all the way till the present day in 2017. You know, Paul's had a lot more years, obviously, to make music than John Lennon did, because John was tragically taken from us 37 years ago in 1980. And of course, in the last 37 years, John Lennon has not been producing new music. So when I say that Paul McCartney had a better solo career, and I think when a lot of people say that McCartney had a better solo career, what they're actually doing is they're thinking overall, and they're not really realizing that John Lennon only released material in 7 years. Think about that. I mean, if we're talking about, say, the Beatles breakup, Lennon released solo albums in the years 1970, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, and then he took a 5-year hiatus and came back in 1980 for the last album, Double Fantasy, and that's 7 years. So really, isn't it fair when you're comparing the output in the solo years of John and Paul to really compare only the same 7 years that they each had material out, which is what I aim to do. You know, I give it to Paul for the entire, 47 years, no problem. But when we're giving it just to the two of them, when they're comparable for the years they actually recorded music together, I think you might find a surprise in that they're pretty much tied. I think when John and Paul were together in the Beatles and writing their Beatles songs and taking on the world and changing everything and, setting the new foundation for music worldwide, I think it's fair to say that Lennon and McCartney were equal in the Beatles' output, if you really consider all their work. And I'm here to try to prove, at least in my estimation, and I'd love to see what you think in the comments, that the same thing holds true in the solo careers, which I'm going to go through now. And remember, we're talking about only the years where both men released product. Okay? So to start with, we're going to go with 1970, say. Now, I want to say from the beginning, I didn't count the stuff that John did, the experimental albums when he was still with the Beatles in the 60s, Two Virgins, Life with the Lions. I didn't count those. Not counting live albums and things like that. And same with Paul. I'm not counting the Family Way soundtrack that he worked on. Nothing like that. 1966. So I'm going to start with 1970. And of course, when we get to 1970, I'll try to reduce as much glare as I can here. We start with John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band LP and Paul's McCartney album. Now, here we have two albums, one by John and one by Paul. And look at them both. They're both good albums. And which one would you say takes this particular round if we were just going to have a fun kind of like contest? You could say that both these albums are tied. They're both good albums. But for me personally, I'm going to put John Lennon's, for this particular round of 1970, as the superior album. Although it's not really always listenable in the sense that it's kind of a dark and depressing and gloomy album, it's still his masterpiece. It's often considered one of his best works, if not his best work. Always comes up high in rankings of solo Beatle albums. And I'm going to say that, for me, John takes this particular round. So now we come to 1971, and this is really a tough one because both of these albums are great. A lot of people think these may be the best two albums by the two of them. We got John Lennon, the Imagine album here, and Paul McCartney, the Ram album. This is their 1971 output. And, Ram, I have to say, is my all-time favorite Paul McCartney album. I think this is his best album. It's really been enjoying a lot of reappraisal these days, okay? But John Lennon's Imagine contains his signature song and is considered one of his greatest albums too. So I would say that both of these albums from 1971, I'll declare this a tie. There's not one that's better than the other. This is a dead tie. Okay, so that's how we do for 1971. Now, when we get to 1972, we have to bend the rules a little bit because this is John Lennon's album from 1972, sometime in New York City. And this is an album that Paul put out in December of 71. So this is late 71 for Paul, the Wildlife album, his first Wings album. So really, when you think about it, this particular album here, we'll call it a 1972 album, right? It came out in December 71. It was probably more known in 72, got more play in 72. Now these albums are, what they have in common is that most fans and critics consider these two albums to be the least albums by John and Paul. This is considered John's so-called worst album. This is often considered Paul's worst album. Now, whether that's true or not, it's a matter of subjective opinion. Everybody can find something to like. Personally, I enjoy both these albums. I enjoy them both. I like Sometime in New York City, and I enjoy Wildlife. So, which one is the better? I think they're both, again, like proving here that when we get to this comparison, both of them had a dog. Both of them had an album that was considered a misfire, kind of like a lower tier, maybe the worst albums, arguably, that they've released, each man. So what do we do here? I call it a tie. That's how I do. So again, Lennon and McCartney are tied. Then we go into 1973. And the way I'm going to do this is, because Paul, it's the same kind of thing that just happened, what we just did with 72 in a way. Paul has Red Rose Speedway in 1973. John Lennon has Mind Games. I don't think either one of these albums is considered the best album by either one. I think both of them, it's fair to say, kind of wind up in the kind of like average kind of category. They're both like middle of the road albums. For me personally, I'm going to say I prefer Mind Games though by quite a margin. So for me personally, and your mileage may vary again, for me personally, John takes this round in 1973 with the Mind Games album. Otherwise, if you want to call it a tie, so be it. But some people may prefer Red Rose Speedway. Either way, I think it's fair to say both men here, both ex-Beatles, if you will, are evenly matched again. So then we go into 1974, and as we get to 74, again, I got to do what I did for Paul's Wildlife. This album, often considered Paul's best album, Band on the Run, came out in late 73. But it was a big hit in 1974. So we can squeeze a little bit and consider this a 1974 album because it came out at the tail end of 73 and was big in 74, huge in 74. And that John Lennon's album, Walls and Bridges from 74. So this is pretty much the 1974 output. Now, I love Walls and Bridges, and it pains me very much to have to say that put against McCartney's Band on the Run, I'm going to say Band on the Run here is the superior album. Okay? So I'm going to give this one to Paul. And for me, out of all the rounds that I've done, either they've been, John has been ahead or they've been tied. In this particular case, we'll give it to Paul. Now we go to 1975. And this is the last year that John Lennon released product before he went into retirement for 5 years. So this is really the last year of the 70s that we could compare the two men. We have Paul's Venus and Mars album with Wings. And we have John's Rock and Roll album, which is a collection of oldies from the 50s. Now, out of these two albums, I definitely think Paul's Venus and Mars is superior. But that's an easy win. Because we could also bend and say, well, you know, there's no competition here and it's not really a fair contest because John's isn't even original material. This is all material that's cover versions, oldies. So really, there's no original output from Lennon here. So McCartney easily wins 1975. But bearing in mind, John did not have a studio album in 75. So we give this to Paul easily. Now, the years that come in the 70s, 1976, Lennon was in retirement. So we can't count it. Paul would go on in 76 to do his Wings Over America tour, a phenomenal tour. He had big hits with Silly Love Songs and Let 'Em In. He continued to top the charts. And in 78, Paul would go on to have Wings London Town and have With a Little Luck as another big hit. Let's not forget in 1977 in the UK, the song Mull of Kintyre became a huge chart topper for Paul in 1977. But during these years, Lennon was retired. He didn't do anything. So, you know, when you look at the overall picture, again, Paul is pretty big there for his whole career. But we're only counting the years that Lennon was active. So let's go to 1980, the final year that the two men had an album out. Paul had McCartney 2 in 1980, and John had Double Fantasy. Now, it's come to the point for a long time now that I really enjoy McCartney 2. I think McCartney 2 is a really fun experimental album, and I like it as a change of pace for Paul. And it's gotten a lot of reappraisal and appreciation by some people in recent years. But I don't think there's any doubt that John Lennon's Double Fantasy is the better album. I mean, here alone, he's got the hit songs, Starting Over, Watching the Wheels, Woman, Beautiful Boy. I mean, right there is quality Lennon, you know. So John in 1980 also wins. And as we know, at the end of 1980, we lost John. And Paul went on to make some great music from 1980 to the present day, and we're all awaiting his new album that's due to come out next year in 2018. But I hope that what I was showing you kind of gives you an idea of where I'm coming from here. Now, just to put the icing on the cake a little bit, I have some 45s here that I've accumulated, and the 45s aren't an exact science because Paul, I think, released more non-LP exclusive 45 tracks than John did. And we're talking about tracks here that were not really on proper studio albums. But like if we want to say Give Peace a Chance by John or Cold Turkey. I don't have a Cold Turkey single yet, picture sleeve, so consider 2 in 1. Either we could take Give Peace a Chance or Cold Turkey, whichever one you want, and put it against Paul's Another Day. Another Day is a great song. I got to give it to Paul. But I don't like Give Peace a Chance much. Never did. It's not much of a song. It's an anthem. It's a good anthem, but it's not much of a song. So I like Paul's Another Day here. But if I had the Cold Turkey 45, I'd give it to Cold Turkey. So again, kind of evenly matched for me there. Now we're going to compare. Let's see. Oh, I don't have them exactly together here. Well, we'll do Paul's High, High, High single, a great non-album track that I like. But we also have John's Instant Karma. This is a tie. I love Instant Karma and I love High, High, High. It's hard. If I had to give the edge, I'd give it to John here. I mean, John's got Power to the People. Paul's got Mary Had a Little Lamb. What do you like better? I'll take Power to the People over Mary Had a Little Lamb. But, you know, as I say, this is not by any means an exact science. You still have Paul doing Give Ireland Back to the Irish, which is a really powerful protest song. And if you want to look at the Sometime in New York City album, if you want to compare the two Irish songs, what do you like better? Paul's Give Ireland Back to the Irish? Or you prefer John's Luck of the Irish from Sometime in New York City? Two different tempos, two different approaches. Well, one last thing I'm going to do. We're getting near the holiday season. Christmas is upon us. And so I'm going to talk about the two Christmas songs. They play these every year on the radio. We have John Lennon and Yoko Ono doing Happy Christmas, War is Over. Classic Christmas track. And Paul McCartney's Wonderful Christmas Time. Which one's the better Christmas song? Both men in the 1970s released a Christmas song. Both of them are played every year. Both of them have become standards every year. I think it's fair to say that most people prefer the John Lennon song. So as you can see by this particular example here, both of these men are pretty tied when we're talking about songs and albums and singles that they released together at the same time, kind of in the same years they were both working. Had John worked the last 37 years, had he been alive with us, it would be much different. But I've come with my list, and your mileage may vary, and please, I invite you to tell me what you've come up with. But in my list, I have John has 3, Paul has 2 rounds, and as a tie, there's 2 or 3 rounds each. So it's either John or tied. Some people may disagree, but I think whether you prefer Paul's releases in these particular instances or whether you prefer John's, I think it's pretty fair to say again, they're locked pretty tied. I hope I've made my point. Thanks for watching.